Now, in our earlier module, we talked about the progressive presidents, right, such as Theodore Roosevelt. And the progressive presidents, in terms of international matters, had no problem intervening in other countries' business. Okay, so let's talk a little bit about Roosevelt and how he intervened in other countries, such as in Latin America. And in particular, we're going to talk about the case of Colombia. Okay, so you have Roosevelt wanting to buy part of Colombia in order to build a canal which will connect the Atlantic Ocean and the Pacific Ocean. Okay, it's going to save a huge amount of time if this is able to happen, right? So you can have merchant ships traveling from the Atlantic to the Pacific, getting to the west coast of the United States, saving about 8,000 miles, right? That's much more efficient. And so he wanted to go through the area of Panama, right? He wanted to create a canal, right? This is actually a plan even before Roosevelt. There had been other attempts to try to build a canal there in Panama to create a waterway which can get you from the Atlantic to the Pacific, okay? But Roosevelt wants to make it happen, and so he is trying to buy this strip of land from Colombia because Panama is part of Colombia at this time. Colombia is like, no, no, we refuse. We're not gonna sell it to you, all right? It's our land. We can do whatever we want with it. But Roosevelt says, no, I'm going to intervene here. I'm going to make this happen. And so he does. The United States is going to instigate an independence movement, right? Panamanian independence. All right. And so the leader on the ground who's actually running the independence movement is a man by the name of Felipe Bunal Varilla. Okay. And Varilla is an employee of, guess what? The Panama Canal Company. All right. So you work for the canal company, and Roosevelt wants to create the canal, and it looks like it's kind of interrelated. Oh yeah, it definitely is. And when Colombia tries to fight back to stop this rebellion, stop Panamanian independence, the U.S. is going to send its navy to fight against Colombian forces and to deter them from stopping the rebellion. And so, yes, the rebellion is going to be successful. Panama is going to gain its independence from Colombia, and the U.S. is going to get what it wants because Bunal Varilla is going to sign a treaty with the United States, okay? Recognizing that the U.S. has sovereignty over this little strip of land, just 10 miles. It's known as the Canal Zone, the Panama Canal Zone, okay? And so the U.S. basically, it's like part of the U.S. You could think of it that way. The U.S. controls this area. And within that canal zone is, yeah, the Panama Canal. It's going to get built, right? A lot of manpower, it takes a long time, but eventually, boom, the Panama Canal is built, and we have that waterway connecting from the Atlantic to the Pacific. But just keep in mind, this is an example of U.S. intervention in Latin America, and it's just one example of many, many, many. We don't have time to go over all of them in this module, but just keep in mind that the U.S. was heavily involved in influencing the governments of Latin America, and this is one example of that. Okay, so still on the issue of U.S. intervention in Latin America, let's talk about the Roosevelt corollary. Okay, still talking about Theodore Roosevelt. And so the Roosevelt corollary is like an addition to earlier foreign policy of the United States. It's building on something called the Monroe Doctrine. The Monroe Doctrine was basically the United States telling European powers, hey, the Western Hemisphere is off limits. Don't try to come here and colonize the Latin American countries, which had gained their independence mostly from Spain, right? And so they were young, struggling republics in Latin America, many of these countries that gained their independence. And so a lot of them had to borrow money from different European powers or European banks, and that's how they were, developing their countries. But in many cases, they couldn't pay back the European banks, and so there was the threat of European powers coming to the young Latin American republics and trying to take them over. Okay, and so the Monroe Doctrine was saying, hey, don't try that. Don't try to come influence Latin America. Why? Because Latin America is the sphere of influence for the United States, U.S. only. This is our area. So European powers stay out, right? Okay, so that's the Monroe Doctrine, right? Just to kind of bring you up to speed. The Roosevelt corollary is an addition to that. It's going one step further. Okay. And so Roosevelt, what he's saying is, you know what? The US has the right to intervene in Latin American countries in the Western Hemisphere using its military. Okay. Why? Because instead of having European powers come and try to force Latin American countries to repay their debts, the US is going to intervene and make sure that Latin American countries are going to repay their debts, right? So now, it's like the US has become the police force for the world, or at least for the Western Hemisphere. Okay, and so you're going to see examples of this. Like I said, we already talked about the example of Panamanian independence. There's also intervention that took place in the Dominican Republic, right, where this is an example of where a country could not pay back its loans, and European powers, may have intervened. So the U.S. steps in first and sends in its military, and U.S. troops are there. They're going to take over customs houses in the Dominican Republic. And if you don't know what a customs house is, this is where import-export taxes are collected. So it's a source of revenue. That's why the troops are taking over the customs houses, and that revenue is what the government gets its money, basically. You see, and so if the U.S. controls the customs houses, it could direct where the money's going to go. It could use it to pay back European investors, bankers, and American bankers who also lent money to the Dominican Republic. So, this is another example of the U.S. intervening in the issues of Latin American countries. Also, keep in mind that U.S. businesses are also intervening in Latin American countries, right? So businesses like the United Fruit Company will go into Latin American countries, and they become one of the biggest employers. They buy up a huge amount of land, and these are mostly agricultural companies. Right, so the United Fruit Company is like a major agricultural corporation. They set up banana plantations in countries like Honduras, Costa Rica, and they become like the center of the economies in those countries. Right, and so it's big business, lots of money, and they dominate politics as well, or they influence politics in those countries. So American businesses and the government are playing a role in intervening in Latin American countries. Okay, so after Roosevelt, you have President Taft. Right, we talked a little bit about Taft, and Taft also intervenes in Latin American countries as well, but he's a little bit different. He's not so much pushing the Roosevelt corollary where we're going to send in troops, to influence things in Latin America. Instead, Taft is following a different policy. His policy is known as dollar diplomacy. Okay, so the idea behind dollar diplomacy is that we're not going to send in the military to influence things. No, but we're still going to try to influence Latin American countries, but instead we're going to use a different approach. We're going to use investment from U.S. companies and loans from U.S. banks, and through this investment and through these loans, we can still dominate the economies of Latin American countries and use them to our advantage. Okay, so dollar diplomacy. Right, and after Taft, you'll have President Woodrow Wilson, who we touched on a little bit in an earlier module. Wilson, again, is going to also intervene in Latin American countries, and his approach is known as moral imperialism. And so Wilson, similar to Roosevelt, believes in intervening with the military. So Wilson's going to send troops in to a number of Latin American countries. Why? Well, because for one, they want to control elections in some countries. Because what if someone gets elected to president in some of these Latin American countries, and that president wants to gain independence from economic control from the United States? Huh? Or what if that president wants to nationalize certain industries where U.S. businesses are operating in his country? He wants to, take away those businesses and have those businesses become, a part of the nation, under the nation's control instead of under the control of these U.S. businesses. And so that's not good. So if basically, if there are political changes or economic changes in a Latin American country that threatens U.S. interests, well, then Wilson feels that it's his right to step in and send in troops to those countries to control what's going on so that the U.S. interests are protected. Okay, so these are examples of how the progressive presidents used intervention, oftentimes military intervention, in Latin American countries so that the U.S. can profit and use these Latin American countries as its sphere of influence, dominating them economically